this video lecture series for ethics. Thus far in our examination of Aristotle, we've seen the major and most important basic components of his theory. We've seen his view that every single action and every choice has an end. We've seen how he uses this claim to argue that human life as a whole must have an end. There must be a final end or purpose to human life. We've seen him cash out that purpose in terms of fulfilling our function as human beings, which he identifies as activity in accordance with reason. And of course, he thinks we can only achieve activity in accordance with reason. We can only act in a way that follows reason if we develop virtue. So he turns in Book 2 to explaining to us how it is we develop virtue and a virtuous moral character, and how we do so through habit. So these are the primary elements of his theory, and this week we're going to take a look at some of the sections in the middle of the Nicomachean Ethics, which cash this out a little more and explain some important virtues and important concepts that, for Aristotle, are important to understanding full human flourishing. And in this video in particular, we're going to begin to look at a virtue that Aristotle calls greatness of soul. And this is an important virtue for a couple reasons for us. First, it's going to connect in a very important way with our previous discussion of external goods and how they feed into living a flourishing human life. And not only that, it's going to touch on specifically the topic of honor and dishonor and how we are to pursue honor as one of those external goods. So let's take a look at greatness of soul. And in fact, although the main discussion he gives of greatness of soul is chapter 4, book 4, chapter 3, the first place he discusses greatness of soul can be found in book 2 in chapter 7. And here he gives us a basic outline or definition of the virtue itself. So he says, in honor and dishonor, the mean is greatness of soul, while the excess is referred to as a kind of vanity. The deficiency, smallness of soul. So remember, for any virtue, whether it's honesty or justice or temperance or courage, there's always some disposition or psychological ability that we have that we're supposed to be regulating in the correct way. So he tells us greatness of soul deals with our disposition to think we are worthy of being honored, worthy of being praised, or worthy of feeling pride for our accomplishments. So we all have some tendency to do this, to think that we've accomplished something great and we deserve rewards as a result, to be honored and praised and feel prideful. And so if you hit that just right, then Aristotle says that you have what is known as greatness of soul. But if you have too little of it, he says you have smallness of soul, and if you have too much, he says you have vanity, you're a vain person. Okay, so this is important because first we should notice that honor is one of the external goods that Aristotle previously talked about. He said honor and power and influence and wealth, these are all external goods. And while he did, of course, say that a life oriented around honor cannot constitute human flourishing and happiness, he does think some external goods are important, and this just gives us confirmation of that. Some level of honor and pursuing and recognizing and wanting praise from others is natural and good and contributes to the flourishing of a human being. Of course, too much is a vice, and so is too little, and so we'll get into those details. But there is a right amount of honor for us to desire and want and think we're worthy of. And he makes these points again once you get to Book 4, Chapter 3. He starts to describe the nature of greatness of soul in the following way. Aristotle is talking, if then he thinks himself worthy of great things, and above all the greatest, and if he is indeed so, he will be concerned with one thing in particular. So first we're talking about someone in terms of greatness of soul who has accomplished something great, who has accomplished something uncommonly good, which perhaps most people just simply would not have the ability to accomplish. And if you're in that sort of position, if you have attained the heights of athletic excellence, if you develop the cure for cancer, any sort of great accomplishment, one thing you should wonder to yourself is, what attitude should I take toward this accomplishment? So Aristotle continues on, worth is spoken of with reference to external goods. and the greatest external good we should assume to be what we render to the gods. So he draws an analogy here. He says, in the ancient Greek mythological tradition, there were many gods, and there were different ways of honoring these gods. And Aristotle points out that, well, one of the greatest goods we give to the gods is honor. We praise them. We glorify the gods. And of course, this is an external good because the praise or honor that anyone receives is not up to you. It's up to the people doing the praising. But if in fact it is a good that we give to the gods, then it must be an external good of some importance. And so he says, the good most aimed at by people of worth, and this is the prize for the noblest achievements. So while we need an array of external goods, we need health and wealth and all those sorts of things, and some power and influence and resources, he says that actually honor, while an external good and so below virtue, is still the most important external good, given that it is a prize for achieving something noble and great. And so he tells us the great-souled person then is concerned with honors and dishonors in just the right way. Okay, so one thing to notice about greatness of soul is that it's a little bit different from other sorts of virtues. It would fall under a general category of virtue that I'm going to term greatness, and I want to distinguish it from some other sorts of virtues so you see what's distinctive about it. So first of all, let's consider virtues of benevolence, right? It's just a general category, and under this category you might put kindness or charity, right? So the benevolent person is moved by care and a concern for others. They engage in self-sacrifice, and they de-emphasize the importance of their own interests. So the person who really has the virtues of benevolence says, there are many people out there suffering who are in need of help, who I'm in a position to help. I want to reduce suffering, make the world a better place. I want to care for others. So I'm kind, I'm charitable, I think primarily about the interests of others, and to a relative degree de-emphasize my own interests. So this is one sort of virtue. And Aristotle, like any other ethical philosopher, would admit that benevolence is important. Now there's also another category of virtue which we'll label justice. Now the just person, the person who is just, insofar as they're just, their focus isn't primarily on necessarily reducing suffering. In fact, in some cases, justice might demand suffering, specifically in terms of punishment. But what the just person is more concerned with is they're moved by a sense of duty, and they emphasize the importance of fairness and equality. So whereas the benevolent person says, I'm going to sort of rank my own interests perhaps below the interests of others, below the interests of those I can help, the just person says it emphasizes the fundamental equality of all people. There's a sense in which they're moved by a sense of duty. You say, well, all people deserve a basic set of sort of human rights, you might say, and it's a duty I have to respect those rights and treat all people fairly by, for instance, not lying to them, not stealing, not murdering, etc., etc. Those are sort of the demands of justice. So benevolence, there's a sense in which benevolence has a sort of quality of inferiority of the benevolent person to those they're helping. Justice emphasizes equality. And now we have the category of greatness, under which we would put greatness of soul. So what is the great person like as opposed to the benevolent person or the just person? Well, the great person is moved by ambition, even pride perhaps, and has a sense of their superiority above the common person. So think about, for instance, what it would really take to achieve something so difficult and so arduous as, for instance, finding a cure for cancer. Well, you'd have to say, well, this person must have a deep sense of confidence in themselves. They would have to have ambition to tackle a task that seems almost impossible, for which they know there's a very large probability they may not be successful. And were they to be successful in that endeavor, and this is one of our major topics I want to look at here, there's a sense in which it would be very hard for them to then go about emphasizing the fact in which they're equal to others. Because clearly not everyone can find the cure to cancer. You'd have to be, really a genius in order to take on such an endeavor. Most people simply don't have that capacity. So those who do achieve something great that sets them above others, there's a sense in which explicitly or at least implicitly, they have to recognize their own sense of superiority. So we have these different sorts of virtues, and the reason I bring this out is because we might be more comfortable in some ways with benevolence and justice as moral virtues. We say, yeah, it's good to sacrifice yourself for the sake of others. Maybe not always, but certainly some amount of self-sacrifice is a good moral virtue. And of course, we think equality is important, right? Everyone should be guaranteed a certain set of basic rights that we have a duty to respect. But it might seem weird to think about in terms of morality the idea of greatness, the idea of superiority. We might think that's not morality. In many cases, it leads to what's immoral, to putting yourself above others. And so one of the things I'm really going to be focused on here is how can we have a virtue like greatness of soul, which is concerned with pursuing honor, demanding praise and honor in the right way, when that praise and honor is supposed to be for something that makes you superior to the average person. And to make this point clear, we might think about two different sorts of criticisms that one might make of greatness of soul. Right? So Aristotle tells us greatness of soul also seems from its name to be concerned with great things. And there's a couple ways in which we might be uncomfortable with that. One I've been hinting at, right? So, and just to be clear, you'll see me sometimes use the word magnanimity. That's just another way, another word for what Aristotle calls greatness of soul. And so later on, we're going to be looking at this article by Michael Austin called Magnanimity, Athletic Excellence, and Performance-Enhancing Drugs. And in that article, he makes the following statement. He says, "This is because the magnanimous man, the person with greatness soul, offends the spirit of equality. Some of what Aristotle says about magnanimity is troubling to the modern mind." And there's good reason for that, right? If you think about Aristotle's day and the sort of society he lived in, it was very much a society which had the idea that political life should not be fundamentally equal. Certain people had different abilities and were best suited for different roles in life, right? Some were better suited to be day laborers or carpenters, others members of the intelligentsia, others were better as politicians and meant to rule. And there's a deep sense in which, in fact, because of our different abilities and different situations in life, human beings are not equal. In fact, the idea of political equality is a rather modern idea that to Aristotle's ears and for his conception of politics simply does not take the same sort of position. But of course, in modern liberal democratic societies, equality is seen as a sort of foundation and bedrock of our political philosophy. And because we grow up in this context, it might seem very strange to us, as I was just saying, to see greatness as a sort of moral virtue. So one might be concerned with the idea that, well, if you have greatness of soul, that means you're sort of playing on or recognizing your superiority. But that seems to go against morality. Another criticism you might have of greatness of soul is that it is concerned with honor. And so, for instance, you'll remember that when we covered Epictetus and the Stoic philosophy, he was very much of the view that we should reject all concern for external goods. And if you take that, of course, extreme view, then greatness of soul, being as it is, concerned with honor and praise, will actually just be a path away from flourishing. Right? So here's one of the passages from the Enchiridion. Epictetus says, "When therefore you see anyone eminent in honors or power, or in high esteem, or in any other account, take heed not to be bewildered by appearances and to pronounce him happy." So Epictetus thought pursuit of honor, concern with honor, is antithetical to happiness. So I bring this up just to say there are reasons to be concerned with, or perhaps critical about Aristotle's identification of greatness or greatness of soul as a virtue, and we should keep these in mind as he argues for why greatness of soul matters. And in fact, not only does he think greatness of soul matters, we are going to see that he says greatness of soul is the crown of the virtues. It takes this sort of highest role in that it is a sort of finishing touch. It's the final move or the final thing that the fully virtuous person needs to attain. Okay, so let's get into the details of greatness of soul a little bit. So In one of the passages that where Aristotle describes greatness of soul, he gives the following definition. He says, "A person is thought to be great-souled if 1, he thinks himself worthy of great things, and 2, is indeed worthy of them." So we should notice here that his definition has a subjective component, meaning something to do with the person who has the quality of greatness of soul, and an objective component, something to do with what that person has accomplished. So what is the subjective component? The subjective component is the great-souled person believes they're worthy of their great success and all the honor that goes along with it. So the subjective component is, I've accomplished this great thing, I've found the cure for cancer, and I believe that I'm worthy of the success, and I believe that all the honor and praise I'm getting, I deserve that as well. Then there's the objective component. The great-souled person doesn't just think they're worthy of great things. This person has actually done something that is of great worth, that is of great value. Okay, so for Aristotle, both of these things are necessary, and in fact, we can explain both the excess and deficiency of greatness of soul by asking ourselves, are both the subjective and objective component there? Or is at least one of them lacking? So for instance, let's imagine a case where we say that the subjective component is present. So this person says, I am worthy of great success, I'm worthy of great honor and praise, but the objective component is lacking. So what would that mean? That would mean that this person thinks they're worthy of the greatest things, thinks they're worthy of honor, but has done nothing to deserve it. Or maybe even if they haven't done nothing to deserve it, they haven't done something so great to really warrant their own claims to how wonderful they are. And we've all encountered people like this in our lives, and it's extremely and utterly annoying to hear someone going on about how wonderful they are when we know that what they've actually done is not even comparable to how wonderful they're making themselves out to be. And so Aristotle says if you have the subjective component but you lack the objective one, then you're vain or foolish. He says they're foolish or senseless, and he says this person is ignorant of themselves. They're engaging in a sort of self-deception. They're deceiving themselves into thinking they're greater than they are, and so he says this is the excessive condition of greatness of soul. It's the vice of vanity. Okay, so it's just sort of an excessive pride. But now let's imagine the other extreme. So let's say the objective component is actually present. Let's imagine someone who has actually done something great. This person has, again, achieved the cure for cancer, or mastered a musical instrument, or achieved the greatest heights of athletic prowess. This person has actually done that. But the subjective component is lacking. That means that they've accomplished something great, but they're not owning up to it. So you go to this person and you say, wow, I can't believe how great you shoot a basketball or throw a football or play the piano. I can't believe that you just made this wonderful scientific discovery that's going to allow us to find the cure for cancer. And, you ask the person about this, you try to praise them, and say, oh, I haven't done anything great. Anyone could have done what I've done. Right? There's nothing special about me. And it's interesting because, and this is this idea here, this condition, which Aristotle calls smallness of soul or timidity, is going to be one of my main concern in this video. Because there's a sense in which we have some ambivalence about this sort of person. On the one hand, we might, and I'm going to get to this in a second, we might say this person is humble. There's a certain sense in which when you see an athlete who's just had an amazing performance and they give credit to their teammates and their coaches, you say, wow, that's a virtuous person. On the other hand, though, there's a part of you that's nagging at you and saying, this person, look, we all know what's really going on here. Yes, obviously, in a team sport, everyone depends on their teammates and coaches, but this person, their performance on the field that day was so transcendent, so unlikely, that there's a sense in which this seems to be a case of self-deception too. Like, why are you owning up to the fact that you really do have these skills and talents and abilities that are way better than everyone else in your team and everyone else in general in your position? And so Aristotle takes this view that if you've accomplished something great, but you don't own up to it, you don't think you're worthy of honor and praise, you're being timid, you have a small soul. And he says the view these people take of themselves seems to make themselves worse. And that's the question I want to focus on. Is that actually true? Because as I was just suggesting, we might say, well, wait a minute, what's wrong with what... I mean, when you put it in terms of smallness of soul, as Aristotle does, then yeah, it sounds bad. But, I mean, isn't another word, as I was just saying, for smallness of soul, humility? And isn't humility a virtue? In fact, if you go to the Christian tradition, then traditionally, there are these 7 deadly sins and their 7 corresponding virtues. The 7 deadly sins are pride, envy, wrath, sloth, grief, gluttony, and lust. And there's these 7 corresponding virtues which are supposed to be the cures for those. Humility, kindness, patience, diligence, charity, temperance, and chastity. And if you take a look at the 7 deadly sins, pride is supposed to be the most deadly. This excessive focus on oneself and inability to recognize one's limitations, and most importantly, and specifically if you're talking about a religious context, your inability to recognize that you're a human being who is relatively less powerful, who is less significant in the face of God, in comparison to God. So pride and excessive focus on oneself is supposed to lead to all the other deadly sins of envy, right? I mean, just, if you are extremely prideful, then you'll want for yourself what others have. You'll be angry if you don't get it. That's wrath, right? So it's supposed to lead to all the other deadly sins. And notice what we have in the 7 virtues. Humility is supposed to be an antidote to pride. If you don't want to become prideful, focus on yourself, and be led to the 7 deadly sins, then you ought to become humble. So we might question Aristotle here, well, why is smallness of soul a bad thing? Isn't smallness of soul simply humility? Isn't humility a virtue? Again, don't we praise the athlete who gives credits to their teammate and coaches after they have a transcendent and sublime performance on the field? Okay, so we need an explanation. What is it about smallness of soul that's bad? Why it aspire to greatness of soul? And one way to begin thinking about this is to think about the following question. So this question is posed by a philosopher, Joseph Kupfer, in an article that he wrote about humility that's relatively recent. And he posed the following question. Can a scientist discover DNA or the moons of Jupiter and retain her humility? Can a humble individual compose like Mozart or play basketball like Michael Jordan and realize how good he is? In other words, is humility compatible with knowledge of just how good the individual is? And another way to put it, moving from this question, another way to put it is, are greatness and humility compatible? Can the great person, can the person who's accomplished something transcendent that most people can't accomplish, can that person be humble? And here's an argument that one could give that the great person cannot be humble. So P1, the great individual, the person who's achieved something far superior to what most humans can achieve, must know how great her accomplishments are. But P2, if the great individual knows how great her accomplishments are, then she can't be humble. So conclusion, the great individual cannot be humble. So what's the reason for each of these premises? Well, Kupfer explains one reason for P1, this idea that the great individual has to know how great her accomplishments are. He says, excellent would seem to be a force for thinking highly of oneself, perhaps too highly. However, virtues should not presuppose or require epistemological deficiencies. So epistemological, what does that mean? It's just a fancy philosophical word for having to do with knowledge. And the idea is that if a virtue is a human excellence, then in order to have that virtue, I shouldn't have to have various deficiencies. And it's a deficiency to not know something. It's a deficiency, as I said earlier, to be in a state of self-deception. But imagine we said, okay, the great individual is someone who accomplishes something great but has no idea how great the thing they just did is. Well, that would be a deficiency. That would mean either they just are very unaware about greatness or what's good in the world, Or, again, they're engaging in self-deception. Both of those seem to be deficiencies, so that would mean there's a sense in which greatness is not a virtue, it's not a human excellence. So the first premise says the great individual has to know how great her accomplishments are. Now what about P2? If the great individual knows how great her accomplishments are, then she cannot be humble. Now why is this? Well, there's a number of ways you might put this, but one famous quote from the theologian Martin Luther put it this way. Luther said, "True humility, therefore, never knows what is humble. For if it knew this, it would turn proud from contemplation of so fine a virtue." So he's saying something about the truly humble person. The truly humble person doesn't even know that they are humble, doesn't even know that they have attained this virtue. Because if you know you've attained a certain virtue, and you know you have attained an excellence, then you immediately turn to pride. And if humility is supposed to be an excellence or a virtue, then it can't turn you to vice. It can't make you pursue vice. And so in fact, Martin Luther says that the truly humble person never knows how great or how humble they are. And so what that would mean is if the great individual knows how great her accomplishments are, then she simply can't be humble, because knowing how great you are is incompatible with humility. So the argument concludes, the great individual cannot be humble. Now this might be a bit of a troubling conclusion, because we might say, yeah, humility is important. One should be humble in some respects, but also greatness is important. We should be ambitious and confident and seek after great accomplishments, and perhaps even pursue praise and honor in the right way. So the question we should have is there any way in which we can make these cohere? Is there any way in which greatness can be compatible with humility? And I actually want to suggest there is. I think Martin Luther was incorrect in that statement. I don't think knowing you have a virtue necessarily means that you're not humble. And I think to see this, we need to distinguish and talk a little more carefully about what do we actually mean by humility. So here's two different ways you can think about it. So one sense of humility might be humility as self-deprecation. And humility as self-deprecation just involves always minimizing your accomplishments, talking about your own worthlessness, saying I'm not worthy of any honor or praise, I'm not worthy of anything great. And so certainly if that's what we mean by humility, then that's definitely not consistent with greatness. And of course, this is precisely what Aristotle was talking about with timidity or smallness of soul. Right? Someone who thinks himself worthy of lesser things than he's worthy of is small soul. This person is not they lack, you might say, even self-respect. So if that's what humility means, if it means self-deprecation, then not only is it inconsistent with greatness, it might be inconsistent with your own self-dignity. And this might make humility seem like not such a great virtue at all. But in fact, I think there's a sense in which we can think of humility in a different way that makes it more desirable and even consistent with greatness. And this sense of humility, I'm going to call humility as objective evaluation. And here I'm going to turn to Kupfer again, who gives an explanation of this. So there's a way in which we can achieve something great and still remain humble, and it depends on how we view our accomplishments. So here's what Kupfer says. To be sure, the hero is glad he has performed well and accomplished much. But he does not get carried away with his achievement because he views himself as another item within the objectively valuable scheme of things, to be used and appreciated in the appropriate ways. In this manner, the dimension of objective evaluation keeps the hero at a psychological distance from himself. The humble hero can value his accomplishment without getting a swelled head because he views it impartially, as if done by another person. And that's the key. So let's say you find the cure for cancer. One way you might look at that accomplishment is that this is a great thing, and you know what really makes it great is that I did it. The reason I'm happy that I found the cure for cancer is in fact that I'm the one who found it, and now I get the benefits, I get the rewards, I get the praise. And what this accomplishment really signifies is how wonderful of a person I am. And of course, this can also get annoying. And it's one reason why we like it when star athletes credit their teammates and coaches. So that's one way to look at your accomplishments. But here's another way you can look at that same accomplishment. I just discovered the cure for cancer. I think that is a wonderful thing I did, but the reason it's wonderful isn't because I did it. I would have exactly the same attitude if someone else did it. The reason I think it's wonderful is because all the lives that will be saved, all the suffering that will be prevented, and all just the misery that I've helped to avoid as a result of what I've done. So when you have humility in this sense, you're just objectively evaluating your accomplishments and looking at them as if through the eyes of another person. Because that's what everyone else thinks. No one else thinks that except maybe your parents perhaps, but nobody else is concerned about this accomplishment because you did it. They're concerned with this accomplishment because of how much goodness and greatness and joy it will bring to the world. And so one way to achieve something great without getting, as Kupfer puts it, a swelled head, is to just think about in terms of the value of this accomplishment is from its own objective worth and not because I'm the one who did it. And Kupfer even says this exhibits a certain sort of moral maturity. He says it exhibits the moral maturity that accompanies the diminution of self-centeredness. And right, there's a sense in which what it means to become a more mature moral person is to become less focused on yourself, less focused on your own ego. Right, my son is roughly 1.5. I honestly don't even know. I don't think he can conceive of the idea that other people in the world have interests, that other people in the world can feel pain. Because if the slightest thing happens that makes him uncomfortable, he will, whine and scream and let his feelings be known. But he's more than happy to pull my hair to the point where it's extremely painful and have no remorse over doing so. But of course, he's 1.5 years old. But for an adult to act in a way where they're acting as if what really matters are their own interests, that what matters is the goodness that this accomplishment brings for themselves, and not primarily focus on the goodness it brings for the rest of society, for everyone else, that's just an extremely immature standpoint from a moral point of view. And so there's a couple things to say about this sort of sense of humility as objective evaluation. The value of our accomplishments is not coming from ourselves. It's a more mature way of looking at things. And he even says one final way to think about this is imagine the person who has this sort of humility, who looks at their accomplishments as from an impartial point of view. And let's say this person messes up and they're criticized. Now, if you have humility, how will you react? Well, if you're looking at your accomplishments as if from an impartial point of view, then the fact that you messed up isn't really a reflection on you. The bad thing that happened isn't that you, don't now get the rewards, that you don't get the praise. The bad thing that happened is what you were doing didn't work out. And when someone criticizes you, you take that criticism constructively. You attempt to work to do better in the future. And you also take it as a helpful reminder of your limits. And so rather than have a risky dependence on the regard of others, rather than saying my whole self-worth depends on whether I'm going to be praised from others, the person with this sort of humility is reminded of his positive dependence on other people, social institutions, God, or fortune. The truly humble person isn't self-deprecating. They recognize their accomplishments, but they also recognize that they're dependent on other people for support. They're dependent on society for support. Perhaps they're dependent on God, and maybe even dependent on good luck. And so all of those make them focus less on their self when they're thinking about the value of their own accomplishments. Okay, so I think this is a way in which greatness and humility can be compatible. I will stop there, and we will continue discussing the rest of Aristotle's claims about greatness of soul in the next video. So I will see you then.